Okay. I'm going to try to talk about the air handler. It grows out of a project that I worked on several years ago, a book called Echoes from the Poisoned Well, Global Memories of Environmental Injustice, which I'm using in a new course I'm teaching with comments. This new book also grows out of a book that Frank mentioned that will be coming out in probably 6 months or so. Serving Their Country, American Indian Politics and Patriotism in the 20th Century. I didn't pick the title, or actually I picked the title but not the cover, but I think I kind of like the book cover. And it's a book that details the international context in which American Indians developed their ideas about citizenship and patriotism and democracy in the 20th century, how they are influenced by worldwide events such as World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And I'm really interested in how Native Americans become intellectuals, and I'm using a definition by the Palestinian scholar Edward Said, who defines an intellectual as someone who works to, quote, universalize the crisis, to give greater human scope to what a particular race or nation suffered, to associate that experience with the sufferings of others. So intellectuals we can think of as a class, but I think any group can produce an intellectual that engages critical ideas about citizenship, especially in a world context. And Native Americans increasingly saw themselves as world citizens, to use a phrase by the Seneca anthropologist Arthur Parker during World War I, because they understood that they were invested in what America was becoming in the world, and that it was their goal to shape what America was destined to become, or seen as destined to become, rising as a world power. They also understood themselves as world citizens because they had developed their ideas of themselves in an international context as members of sovereign nations who forged treaty relationships with the United States. And so their argument was, as we go forth in the 20th century and engage the world, we need to continue to define what America is based on its ability to negotiate with people of color and other nations. And so they became patriots, and that's why there's an emphasis on the patriotism. And I use this idea of hybrid patriotism, that they're defending not only their country, their Indian country, but also America itself. Because if they serve America in a way that allows America to become a sort of beacon of hope and to live up to its creed of democracy and so forth, then American Indians will be protected in that geographical space of America. And I want to continue this notion of intellectualism and patriotism in this new book, which I've tentatively titled What the World Will Need to Survive, American Indian Environmentalism in an Age of Global Environmental Crisis. That's a mouthful. I'm sure it'll change a little bit, but it sort of gives you the overview. I'm going to look at similar ideas. I'm going to look at a new generation of eco-intellectuals who situated their ideas in a kind of a global context. The title comes from a statement by a Pueblo named Frank Tenorio, who pledged to protect his Pueblo people's country from natural resource exploitation, but also to help mediate what he had seen as an emerging global environmental crisis in the 1960s. He said, there has been a lot said about the sacredness of our land, which is our body. We have kept our relationship with nature, and now we as a people see that we are one of the few custodians of this kind of knowledge left. Maybe this kind of knowledge is what the world will need to survive. And that statement, I think, captures the two central research questions of this book. One is, in what ways did Native activists contribute to a broad environmental justice movement that draws on the experience of other indigenous peoples around the world who are also facing these pressures of resource extraction because of globalization and degradation through toxic and nuclear wastes? And the second question is, how did these perspectives of environmental crises extend from their own reservation crises, their own country, Indian country crises, to global contexts, including global climate change? So ultimately, I hope the book contributes to what is emerging as a growing subfield of the history of sustainability. And I think this topic certainly fits with Villanova's year of sustainability. I'm sure you're getting a lot of press about the conference next month. We're going to have a lot of diverse perspectives on what's all right, I just wanted to note a few things that environmental historians do with American Indians. One is to think about their experiences in environmental justice, sort of capturing their stories of how they have tried to preserve their land in a way that accords with their cultural traditions. The second theme seems to be exploring the trope of the ecological Indian, and that's a phrase popularized by the work of the anthropologist Shepard Kretsch, who sought to reconcile the noble image of American Indians and American Indian behavior. And we can, you may remember from world history, thinking about Enlightenment figures like Rosier, sort of upholding the American Indian as a paragon of ecological virtue at a time when Europe is experiencing a spiritual and material crisis. That idea of the Indian employed in Western societies as this ecological savior comes out especially in the industrial period and into the World War II. One quote is from a prominent white Indian affairs official who said that Americans would turn to their Indian societies more and more. He's writing in 1947. Seeking there the clues to the saving of the earth, which they have wronged, before that too late time when lethal revenge is taken by the wronged earth. So in the 1940s, after years of carnage, the American Indian emerges as the savior of the sacred earth. They become this enduring symbol. And I've noticed as the global climate crisis intensifies, we see some more references to American Indians along these lines. A recent article noted that American Indians bring a kind of practical environmentalism to the ongoing debate over our relationship to the land and its resources. It is an environmentalism tied to a particular place, one that's been their home for thousands of years. They have learned to live within the limits of its resources. So they become the sustainable Indian, the ecological Indian. And I'll note that American Indians are not opposed to utilizing that image in their own presentations of themselves. I noticed this in a recent New York Times magazine, an advertisement for the American Indian College Fund, and it employs this ecological Indian to sort of stress that American Indians have to go. American Indians need to engage their own recovery through the educational process, and it's an appeal to white Americans to say, let's help American Indians themselves think Indians and restore their knowledge base in a modern context. So thinking Indian thus becomes a kind of opportunity to become more sustainable, and that marriage of the traditional with the modern scientific and ecological infrastructure is one of the themes that I wanted to develop today. So this morning I want to think about a couple of things. One is how American Indians reify this notion of the ecological Indian. In some ways, how they themselves get in touch with the notion that they are ecological, and then how they employ that in a way that becomes a kind of green patriotism, how we can help save America and save the world from the kind of ravages of industrial progress, and also how they engage international organizations addressing similar themes. So that's kind of the overview of the talk, and I want to really focus on the 1960s and 1970s, because that's where I see the birth of what I've called sort of green power that grows out of the red power movement of the 1960s. And I think it starts really with a crisis over Indian land in the Cold War, when the United States begins to take Indian land for dams as part of this industrial progress needed in part to counter the Soviet Union. Who can build the biggest dams, who can generate the most power? Well, American Indians are seen as the easiest people to take land from. And so what we have is a series of crises in Indian country. This is in, I think, North Dakota, one of the most poignant images of this crisis. People losing ancestral lands that they have been on for hundreds, thousands of years. The crisis really accelerates in the late 1950s, 1960s with the Seneca people and the Tuscarora, who have some of the oldest treaties on the books. And here we see this clash of cultural values over land and environment. Some of you may have heard of Robert Moses, the chairman of the New York State Power Authority. He's responsible for a lot of the urban renewal in New York City. He claimed that, quote, the bulk of the Tuscarora land is not used for any purpose at all. That becomes sort of the mantra of white developers who say, well, Indian land is just sitting there. It's not being used. It's not being improved. Tuscarora Chief Clinton Ricard retorts that Moses has spent his career dumping concrete over the landscape, and thus he cannot understand how people could be using land unless they did likewise. Ultimately, the Seneca and the Tuscarora lose their court battles, very contentious, but what they do is they create a series of events that helps to inspire a new generation of red power activists who see the United States as acting in an imperialistic fashion, taking these lands that are protected by treaty. They also represent their activities as patriotic and saying, you know, how can you wage the Cold War and claim that you're representing democracy when in fact you're denying it to people at home? So it lends itself to a lot of new activity. And here I just want to emphasize for geographers this notion, the importance of geography in American Indian cultural traditions, the maintenance of particular places on which sustain particular cultural traditions and practices. It sustains the spirituality. If you take away the geographical space, which has been the source of countless ceremonies, then you take away the source of the identity. And so people Native Americans are defending that geography, that place, in a very real way. They are also defending it on the basis of constitutional protections in the treaties that were signed, and that's something I want to talk a little bit about. We get to another flashpoint in this environmental conflict, which is in Washington State. You have the emergence of the first rent power activists who are defending their right to fish in the rivers and lakes of the Pacific Northwest based on treaties that were signed in the 1850s. It lends itself to what was called the fishing war, because you see the acceleration of violence when you have Washington State troopers crack down on people like this guy who's fishing, and these guys are carrying treaties in their back pocket that says, I have the right to fish here according to the government. The troopers start using tear gas, they start arresting people, they start beating up people, very much like the civil rights conflict down in the American South. You can think of Selma, Alabama, transported to Washington State. Marlon Brando becomes one of the celebrities who goes to Washington State to lend a hand to these people. It becomes a fairly significant event. Here we think about fish as not only a thing that sustains people biologically, but sustains them spiritually. Fish are considered members of the fish nation. They are accorded a certain respect. There are ceremonies that take place to grant the fish certain respect, to create a kind of sustainable life. And here again, this notion of the international status. They are independent nations with contracts, which is what treaties are with the United States. So we have an acceleration of the protests. Here we have them linked to Memorial Day because a number of these activists served in the U.S. Army. Therefore, they say, we defended the United States, please defend our rights. And here's an image from one of the conflicts, and we can remember that this is happening during the Vietnam War, and it very much becomes kind of a domestic war that mirrors the efforts of the Vietnamese people to protect their ancestral homelands from not only a military aggression, but an environmental destruction of their ancestral rice paddies and their homelands. And in fact, what we see is American Indians thinking of themselves as a Vietnamese type people who are being invaded. The other context, I think, is that Native activists are arguing that they have something to offer. And they say, we have much to offer the Americans in terms of sustainable fish practices. One activist talked about the worldwide fisheries problem that was being discussed at international conferences, and they said, we have every right to be at those conferences because we have been fishing for 800 years, we know about sustainable practices, and they ought to respect our place at the table. Their perspectives are being shaped by third world liberation movements that are making Native people think, well, we have the same rights as emerging nations in Africa and Asia. So here's this theme again of American Indians offering ecological knowledge about sustainable practices. Janet McLeod, who was one of the most important activists, links the survival of the salmon and the American Indian and claims that it's a fact that the Indian people have never been despoilers of nature. They are the first and original conservationists. So here is this theme of the ecological Indian emerging in the discourse of these activists. McLeod writes a letter to Lyndon B. Johnson asking him to help against these abuses of Washington state officials. She tells Johnson, look across this land objectively, see the polluted waters, smell the polluted air, gaze upon the stripped and gutted land which sustained our ancestors for thousands of years before your arrival 400 years ago. We cannot help but wonder who has the highest civilization. So this is the other theme, another theme sort of contesting this whole notion of what progress is. If progress leads to the despoilization of the earth, then we have to rethink what progress should be about. I would say that, and again, we can think about Johnson engaging Vietnam at a time. I found a lot of other kinds of editorials that raise this question. For example, one from 1966 said, today we have the senseless cry of development. Soon the country will be completely asphaltized. Parking spaces will abound where forests grew. Life will be prefabricated. Most importantly, this editorial concludes, we must return to the traditional Indian values and regain those virtues which made our ancestors great. So here is a return to the traditional, not only for white Americans, but also for Indians themselves. They have to come in contact with their own traditions. I think the larger theme, though, is how those older traditions become embedded in modern scientific frameworks. And the next dramatic protest is the Alcatraz Occupation of 1969. Some of you may have read about that in some previous classes. But it becomes a moment when the world and Americans' attention is fixed on all of these grievances, American Indians' grievances. You have people in Europe, people in Africa, Asia, covering this kind of third world movement within the United States. What happens is that American Indians occupy the island in November of 1969, which is the precise month when the My Lai massacre happens in Vietnam. So we have this linkages of violence against people of color. So their attention, a lot of attention is paid to what American Indians want. And so they use it as a platform to promote a vision of sustainability. The group that occupies the island protests a federal government which has systematically stolen our lands, destroyed a once beautiful and natural landscape, killed off the creatures of nature, polluted air and water, ripped open the very bowels of our earth in senseless greed. So a kind of continuation of this critique of development. But what's new is that they want to turn the island into an academic center to explore Indian values and to situate an Indian center of ecology that would, quote, train and support our young people in scientific research and practice to restore our lands and waters to their pure and natural state. We will work to depollute the air and waters of the Bay Area. We will seek to restore fish and animal life to the area and to revitalize sea life, which has been threatened by the white man's way. So, in some sense, it's a realization that old traditions aren't good enough anymore. The world has become too polluted and too degraded. They need to understand the modern science of ecology to contribute to this discourse of recovery and sustainability. I would say that the Alcatraz occupation failed for a variety of reasons that I won't go into, but it was a very ambitious agenda. Even though it didn't succeed in creating this Indian center of ecology, they were federal troops escorted the remaining activists off the island in 1971. It became a kind of a symbol of the resurgence of Indian values, and what you start to see in late 1969 is other intellectuals start to embrace these ideas. Vine Deloria, a Sioux, who's probably the most famous Native intellectual post-war period, if you want to think about civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael. Vine Deloria is the Native American version. What is interesting is that his views become published in the New York Times Magazine, the mainstream press, and he's arguing about the danger of total extinction of life unless strong conservation practices are begun at once. And he claims that Indian society is stabilizing itself to face the instantaneous electric world of today far better than Americans. So he's promoting the Alcatraz ideas as the foundation of new ideas about sustainability. So Alcatraz doesn't succeed as a place, but it succeeds as an idea. So what we have then is the emergence of what I call green power activists. And let me give you one more example. The kind of person who is going to restore the traditional ecological Indian and marry it to a scientific framework, what we would call a hybrid framework. Just one other voice, and I'm trying to give you some of the voices of these activists. Let them speak for themselves. This guy from Decorah Parmenton, who's from the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. He writes a December 1969 essay entitled "The Rape of Mother Earth, or Is the White Man a Disease?" This is coming after the Alcatraz. And what I found interesting is that he's quoting from people like Paul Ehrlich, who's a noted Stanford biologist, who in fact gives the first Earth Day talk at Villanova in 1970. So he's reading all these sort of mainstream articles and biologists, and he repeats the mantra that we have put in utter disregard for the delicate balance of living forms. And he documents the scientific problems of DDT and automobile exhaust and antibiotics in agriculture, a very forward-thinking piece. And then he champions young Indian people, quote, educating ourselves on ecology and searching deeply into our Indian heritage. Here's this kind of hybrid approach to modern life. But he's also extending the argument to broader concerns. He writes that we are all involved regardless of race, color, or creed. Life transcends human boundaries, racial lines, and the animal kingdom through all levels of the ecosystem. So he's taking this holistic view that isn't just about the Ho-Chunk Nation or even about America. It's about the way the world needs to be thought of in a unified whole, which I think is both a traditional view, because Native Americans think of sort of unity through the circle, but also kind of the scientific view of a global ecosystem. So, even before, my center is before Earth Day happens, Native Americans are promoting this kind of global eco philosophy through Alcatraz, through editorials, and so forth. And it starts to gain the attention of mainstream press. In February of 1970, before Earth Day, Time magazine publishes this lengthy article about American Indians, and I'll just give you one section of it. The Indians' longing to live harmoniously with nature touches recesses of nostalgia in the minds of many Americans at a time when the drive to protect and restore the nation's physical environment is the most popular cause of the day. Whites' guilt over their spoilage of air, land, and water engenders a new admiration for the Indians who have fought for so long to protect their own plains, lakes, and hunting grounds. So the Indians here, the Ecological Indian finds mainstream expression, and I'd say it finds more mainstream expression the following year with the release of the Crying Indian public service ad. How many of you have seen that? Well, if you haven't, you should check it out on YouTube. Just put in the Crying Indian. And what I found interesting in looking at this, the ad is a public service ad about litter, and it shows this guy traveling by canoe through an urban river, encountering trash, and he's surrounded by factories spewing stuff. And then he stands on the road, and somebody throws a bag of trash at him, and hits him in the foot. And the close-up is of his face, and one solitary tear comes down, sort of symbolizing the shame of America's polluting habits. What I found interesting in going to YouTube recently was that they have resuscitated this, and they brought him back in the 1990s. And the other image that I found was they put this Crying Indian face in a spaceship circling the globe. Think about how NASA is polluting the space. So this, we have these kind of levels of engagement. But he is this very enduring symbol of the Ecological Indian. So check it out on YouTube. One more reason to go to YouTube. And if you can't find it, let me know. I'll send you a link. All right, so most of this is happening in a national context, the ways in which eco-intellectuals are promoting a vision of sustainability to address these increasingly common problems. In 1970 you have rivers catching on fire in Ohio. You have the earth shot that I had up here at the first slide, 1969. People starting to think about their environments in much more conscious ways. What I'm especially interested in doing, and I just don't have a lot of data, but I'm interested in how Native Americans engage international forums. They travel outside of the United States. They go to different places to promote these views and try to create international coalitions, because they understand, again, this notion of the global ecosystem, that it's not just about the reservation, or it's not just about the United States. It's about how the world functions together organically. And I'd say the first important incident where a Native activist goes abroad to explore these ideas is in 1972 at the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Sweden, which may be the first sort of international group. I don't know if it's the first, but it's one of the first efforts of people to come together to resolve what is obviously becoming a serious environmental crisis. A guy named Sid Mills, who's a young Yakima Indian from the Pacific Northwest. He serves in Vietnam. He serves in the fishing wars, trying to defend his people's right to fish. He then extends his experience and goes to Sweden with 24 other American Indian activists to try to both contribute his perspectives, but also gain an understanding of how these new associations are working. And I think American Indians are especially conditioned to that because they have always had to sort of form pan-Indian or pan-national organizations, reaching across language barriers and different cultural experiences with other American Indians. So for them it was natural to go to a UN conference. And he comes away from that convinced that, quote, you don't deal with the problem of environment until you consider the social problems and how you want to live. Proper change would stop pollution and serve all people through an equitable distribution, so using the language of environmental justice. But then he closes with, the Indian people had this, in a past tense. So here's another example of a young activist coming to terms with this environmental ethos, this environmental tradition. And so I think it's common for a lot of Native peoples to sort of recover their own traditions that have been buried by modernity or progress or consumption and so forth. It's been especially hard for the younger people, but they get in touch with their traditions through their elders, and you start to have young people go back to the reservation to learn from the older people, the elders. So that's just one example, and I have a few others to share with you. American Indians are also being shaped by global ecological and environment and economic crises. The oil crisis of 1973 and 1974, the oil embargo by OPEC, creates a lot of shortages in this country. I worked at a gas station in high school during the oil crisis, and I can tell you that there was a lot of angry people, angry at me for not having any gas to give them. But that affects native peoples on their reservations because there is an increased effort to mine their coal and search for gas and uranium. So they experience a rise in pressure for the resources that they own on their lands. So we can go back to thinking about how dams were expropriated from native people. And so it both lends itself to a new level of activism to protect those resources, but also to contribute to a vision of sustainable development. And I've found some evidence that native people are promoting solar energy and wind energy in the 1970s, which is part of kind of a national campaign to find alternative energy sources. For example, this one activist, Susan Harjo, who I'm hoping to bring to campus next year, actually. She joins a group called Minorities Organized for Renewable Energy in the late 1970s, and she promotes a solar energy and energy conservation bank to encourage native use of alternative energy. And I think part of the reason is, well, it's twofold. One is that Native Americans have contributed enormous quantities of coal and uranium and gas, but a lot of native people don't even have energy sources on their reservations. One Hopi, a young Hopi man, said, "Don't tell me about an energy crisis. I don't even have electricity in my village." So even though there's this effort to get energy, there's no grid, there's no infrastructure on their own reservations. But solar energy is a local source. It can be installed on any kind of building. Wind energy could be used. So solar and wind are both part of this larger vision of a sustainable planet, but they also accord with native traditions of low impact on their own land, to preserve their own lands. Native people start to promote these ideas also in international forums. A member of the Navajo group Citizens Against Ruining Our Environment goes to Vienna, Austria in 1992 at the World Uranium Hearings and says, "Why should American Indians sacrifice our land, culture, and future generations so the dominant society can continue to live a lifestyle that demands and depletes our resources?" She argued that viable alternatives are cleaner, safer, and cheaper, and they're available. And this is, again, sort of a very undeveloped part of this project, but I think that, to me, is really exciting just to think about how Native people start to contribute to a growing discourse of alternative energy production in the 1970s. Jimmy Carter put solar energy on the White House in 1979, but when Ronald Reagan came in 1981, he immediately dismantled the system. So we had a moment 30 years ago when the country was beginning to create these programs, and right now we're coming back to it, and we lost a lot of time. I want to leave time for questions, so I wanted to sort of think also about the rise of environmental justice groups, many of which are dealing with the problem of hazardous and nuclear waste being dumped on their land because of the way that some Americans continue to think of the reservation as unused space. This is what activists would call spatial racism. People that will define the space of a minority population, African Americans in the city, Native Americans in the countryside, as space, that's good for the dumping of hazardous waste. the slums are already dirty, so let's just, it's natural that we put it there. Native Americans are the natural stewards of the environment, and so they're the ones who should really deal with this. And that's an argument that's actually used to get Native Americans to agree to house all of this nuclear waste that starts to develop in the 70s and 80s. They start promoting the idea. In fact, they try to use the ecological Indian idea against them to say, hey, you guys are real good at this stuff. We'll give you this stuff, and you can figure out a way to take care of it. So what we have is the rise of all these groups that are trying to oppose both nuclear production and nuclear waste. This is in Nevada in the 1990s. We have a number of other groups. And this pressure that they begin to feel as a result of the energy crisis, and then Reagan and the Republican administration's emphasis on nuclear and coal and so forth, lends itself to new coalitions. Probably the most important of these international groups is the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, 1991 in Washington, D.C., that brings people together from South America, from Canada, United States, from Europe, and other indigenous peoples who are also facing these enormous pressures for resources. And I list them just to give you a sense of how this environmental ethos finds expression in the declaration of principles of environmental justice. We don't need to go through all of them, but we have in number one, very much of an American Indian idea about the Mother Earth. Number two is talking about this idea of environmental racism, people being targeted because of color. And three, this notion of the interest of a sustainable planet, which is very much, again, this continuation of the American Indian idea. So that becomes the foundation for environmental justice around the world. What we have more recently is the effort of Native activists to engage climate change. One of the more recent examples is Bill Erasmus and other members of indigenous groups going to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Poland. Again, continuing work that they've done since the 1970s in Sweden and Vienna and so forth. What we have also is a sort of an increase in number of ceremonies, pan-tribal ceremonies that are going to bring in people from Mexico and Canada and so forth in defense of Mother Earth. And I think the most interesting gathering of note is the gathering just about a year ago in Palenque, Mexico, which brought together groups from 71 Indian nations across the Western Hemisphere. The convening of indigenous peoples for the healing of Mother Earth. And I have the document, it was the declaration. It's about a 10-page document that lists their ideas and their goals, and I have a couple to show you. This is, I think, in part the result of global warming and how it's going to impact indigenous peoples, especially in coastal areas, in Africa, in Alaska, and in island communities. A recognition that people of color will suffer sort of the first wave of any kind of serious problems associated with global warming. You're seeing it in Alaska. You have Alaskan natives coming down to give testimony. Eskimos talking about their degradation of environment because of global warming, their inability to sustain themselves in their traditional ways. So they want to contribute not only their experiences, but their ideas about sustainability. And what we have, and what's interesting is that this is taking place near a Mayan ruin at Palenque. And part of the idea is that there's a recognition that the Mayans may have contributed to their own collapse from deforestation. So they are, sort of not just treating this as a sacred site, but also as a site of previous collapse. And I think they want to make that an important history lesson. Here are just a few quotes to illustrate the efforts of environmental officials. This is not just a bunch of indigenous people. This is a serious effort to create a discourse, a conversation. I think it would have been really cool to be there to hear some of these talks. Here are just a couple of voices from the conference emerging out of this kind of environmental darkness. Again, sort of reflecting on the way that weather patterns and global climate is affecting them, and also sort of trying to engage the scientific discourse and asking them to think about integrated visions or integrated systems. And just one more from this guy, Bill Erasmus. Part of our role is to wake up the world. Again, this idea of going back to the 1960s that Native people have an obligation, they have a responsibility to share their views. So global change, and global climate change in particular, is becoming the major source of inspiration for these groups. And their document is a call to action to the global community. They're reaching from their particular geographical spaces, which have important sacred meaning to them, and they're reaching out to a global community as part of what they hope is a sustainable solution. And they're listing all of these various, they're engaging the language of international global climate change and the Kyoto Protocol. They are becoming familiar with the discourse, this legalistic discourse, but they're trying to inject a kind of spiritual discourse into these deliberations to make it real for people. So my trajectory is to really sort of go from the 1950s and 1960s, where we have the foundation of this new ecological ethos, and then take it into the present day and think about how they're engaging global climate change, both experiencing it as indigenous peoples, but also adding their voices to solutions. So I'm going to end there and leave some time for conversation. Any questions about any of these particular events or ideas?
I've heard and read multiple things lately about how the Maori and New Zealand are really sort of inspiration now for the country and are involved in a lot of their sustainability efforts. Do you see the same sort of thing happening here in the United States? Or have you read anything about how the Maori are really galvanizing that?
How the Maori are influencing here, or?
Yeah, or just how that's been an effective way to promote sustainability.
Right. Well, I see a sort of general turn to the indigenous. I think when you have serious crises, you start to look in a lot of different places for solutions. And the Ecological Indian, I think, is the more dominant theme, but I think because of the way that say Alaskan natives and Eskimos are on the front lines of the melting ice caps, I think those may be more visible symbols, in part because they are coming down to DC. I think last year there was a fairly well-covered event in which Eskimos are sitting there in Congress and sort of sharing their perspectives. So it may be more regional or more local than the Maori, but certainly in every country has their own sort of experience with the indigenous. In Australia, you've got the Aboriginals, the Maori in New Zealand. There are a lot of different types. I think people are a lot more open to them, to legitimize them, but I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence that people are really paying attention. How these ideas get translated into policy is another matter. But I think, for me, it's that they are trying to create kind of a moral or spiritual center for these conversations about science.
Well, and that idea of this conversation or this bringing together of the sort of ecological Indian with this more modern knowledge, that's really interesting. And I guess one of the last quotes you put up, though, the fellow was saying that scientists compartmentalize, right, which isn't which sort of promotes disharmony and imbalance. And I guess I'm wondering how much of a conversation is there, how brought together has that been, the science and this sort of ecological perspective for them?
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's widely different.
Well, that's a good question. Coming from the sort of study of history, I don't know what shapes science. I mean, I think people have their own experiences with environmental degradation or their own environmental values. I don't think they necessarily need American Indians to tell them, what to value. But I think these kind of groups get at the kind of widespread conflict that people have, and it gives some tangible examples of people who are really suffering already, so that it's not an abstract thing. And I suppose, scientists, and some of you may, and I know that Cal goes up to Canada, and some of you may be studying sort of places on Earth where there are people who are struggling to maintain their environments. So scientists, I think, in some ways have to come to terms with those places. Whether they come to terms with the ideas of those people is another matter. I don't know. But there should be, I would think, a new receptivity to the ideas. But this again, it's not going to necessarily. It's going to help wake people up, as this person says. Whether they can contribute biological knowledge or scientific knowledge is another question. And this is, I think, in part why you have American Indians themselves who want to become scientists, who want to sort of link those two. They see value in that.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of part of the question. Obviously, they're contributing, but also on the end of, within the Native American community, how much of a scientific literacy is there about something like global change? Does it tend to be perhaps higher than the general U.S. literacy on this issue?
Maybe not scientific literacy. I mean, it's a good question to think about how Native Americans as a population certainly are struggling to get into college, to get funding. The American Indian College Fund, there are a few others that are trying to promote this. I'd say it's only in the last 20 years or so that you've seen a real increase in the number of American Indians going to technical school. There are engineering associations and so forth. I don't know if there's a big infrastructure. But you have people like, activists like Susan Hargo who are engaging in alternative energy. I mean, that to me becomes a really important area of study to think about. And I think what you find is the recognition that global warming is in part the product of fossil fuel production, which creates the wastes that could be dumped on American Indian lands. So they're going to promote alternative energy, not just to forestall that, but also to make a real contribution. So I see more and more reservations sort of adopting wind energy, and I'm going to start paying attention to how they frame it, whether it's part of it's economic, but part of it is also as a good integration of their cultural practices and their larger environmental beliefs.
One reaction that I have to your whole analysis is that it kind of treats American Indians as a monolithic entity. The reality is that there's so much diversity, both historically and present day, in economic situations, but also just the connection to the land. A lot of tribes don't live where they were originally found. They've been moved around, and that happened even before Columbus showed up. So the Plains Indians weren't where they had been a couple hundred years before Columbus showed up. So I'm wondering if there's a need to get more into the diversity among different groups of Native Americans that find themselves in different economic circumstances and different historical perspectives, and see what we can learn from how much variation there is, and is that a constraint on some of these movements, or is it creating friction within the Native American community? I mean, most Native Americans in New England, you probably wouldn't hear very much about sustainability of the land. It's about sustainability of the casino.
Right.
And so it changes the whole dynamic of the culture and the attitudes of the young people coming up,
Yeah.
how they see themselves moving forward in the world. A whole can of worms there.
Right, no, I agree. And I'm focusing sort of on the intellectual side of the creation of these ideas of the ecological Indian and how people...
They're at the leadership level.
Well, and also just how it's people kind of come to terms with it. They rediscover it. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as environmentalists or as the ecological Indian until they've become engaged in political struggles over land use and so forth. But you're absolutely right. There are, especially in the Pacific South, in the American Southwest, there are conflicts over economic development versus environmental development. On the Navajo reservation, I've been out there a few times with students from Villanova. We have a mission trip out there, and they have experienced tremendous degradation because of the coal mining, but that also generates so much revenue to fund the tribal government. And they have experienced a lot of health problems from uranium mining. The Laguna Pueblo and the Navajo were the two largest Native American uranium mines, and they have the cancer and the deaths has been staggering. And even still, there is an effort from nuclear mining companies to go back to the Navajo to get new mining permits, and there are people that would grant them because they are desperate for funds. So this is not as you say, it's not black and white. There are a lot of people in between who are torn, and yet I think that there is an increasing recognition that in terms of sustainability, because of the prevalence of dumps and so forth, that there are opportunities now. So what we find, I think, are some American Indians buying into notions that they may not have thought of until recently.
Well, I think, especially if you extend the perspective beyond the U.S., even more so than has been the case in the U.S., you get the interconnection between some of the ecological attitudes, tribal identity, and politics at sort of the national level. So in Mexico, for example, the fighting in places like Chiapas and Oaxaca is all about tribal identity and economic identity, but sometimes that is compatible with developing a sustainability view that is supportive, and sometimes it actually goes in the opposite direction, which then gets to be a big problem.
Yeah, we were just talking about that in our class, Global Environmental Justice, yesterday, talking about the Amazon and the rubber tappers who may not have thought of themselves as dealing with global climate change, but they help to create a conversation between their local needs and a larger agenda of preserving the forests. And so it's that kind of conversation that I think can be very productive, especially for people in some of these hot zones that have to be situated in a global context when we talk about global warming. So I think, thinking ahead to my book, I'll have to talk about the conflict over economic development and environmental protection, because all of those environmental justice groups were not always supported because they were talking about eliminating some opportunity that becomes important for other people.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the spatial racism, and just like the dynamic that occurred. Was it just the tribe leaders that were dealing with, like, is that outside of the community, or what exactly occurred there?
Well, they're starting in the 1980s. You see this. You see a couple of keywords emerge from the efforts of African Americans and Native Americans, Latino, who are dealing with the brunt of industrial pollution. Their neighborhoods are being targeted by waste companies. The politicians are granting the permits because those communities don't have the political power to get them halted. And so people start talking about environmental racism. That and I had a definition of that. That people. in the 1980s, it's really, you know, the notion of environment and civil rights coming together, that environmental degradation is the new context for civil rights. And so that space matters. People will think of an African-American community as powerless to stop the creation of biological waste, hazardous waste, and so forth. And reports come out of the 1980s show that the majority of hazardous toxic wastes are situated in communities of color. In our class, we talked about a community down the road called Chester. Some of you may have driven past it on 95. It's probably one of the worst places in the country for the concentration of industrial wastes. So that once you get one dump in there, it becomes a place where you can put dumps. And then you have more and more places, so that you have a sort of acceleration of toxicity with corresponding health problems. And people of color will see that as discrimination based on, you know, based on their people's perception of the value of that space and the people in it. And it corresponds with Native Americans who see themselves targeted because people don't understand the value of their space. They see the reservation as this wide open space. They don't see it as a place where ancestors have died or where they have relationships with nature and so forth. And so environmental justice comes out of people's experience with environmental racism, and you start to see common experiences, Latinos in the city, African Americans in rural parts of the South. So space matters, and how, you know, how people define it based on these kind of cultural attributes.
As climate change is becoming more apparent, do you think most of the threats to Native American space or land has shifted from encroachment of companies or the government to physical changes like ice melting or snowpack melting earlier, things like that? Do you think that that's having more of an effect than encroachment?
It's a good question. I mean, I think my focus has been on, you know, the 48 states and not, I mean, I really have to talk about Alaska. Those, I tend to sort of segregate Alaskan natives because they have a different set of laws that govern them. I think there will certainly be climate changes, you know, over the long period in the Southwest, where you have a lot of Native people living, Oklahoma, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and so forth. I don't know what that impact will be. What I see is an increasing number of companies trying to get wind power on these reservations, which I think is a new opportunity, but, you know, given the history of fraud and ill treatment, I think a lot of people are skeptical about that. So I think you'll, with the nuclear waste problem, we still haven't really resolved that. They may find, you know, increased pressure to hold those wastes if nuclear energy comes back as an alternative to coal. So I think there'll probably be some cycles. You know, they'll experience what everybody else will deal with out there, but they will always be targeted. I think that becomes their fear.
It seems to me that the concept of the ecological Indian is really rooted in tradition, and I'm wondering how children growing up on reservations in such a modern world are, you know, holding on to that tradition, and whether or not they can maintain being ecological Indian.
The question is how young Native people, children growing up, you know, understand in the modern world. I mean, that's a really good question.
It just seems so different from the time, like, even way back when, hunting and gathering, you know, it's like there's fast food down the road now. Right. It's such a different world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see a lot of Native people. For one thing, half of the American Indian population lives in cities or suburbs. So there are a lot of people who are disengaged from the land itself. And one of the things I see in the Red Power era is that these urban Indians who grew up with their parents after they moved off the reservation because there were no jobs, they go back to the reservation and they rediscover their relationship with land, and have these powwows with elders and so forth. Whether that's sustained or not, I don't know. I mean, I think there are a lot of, I have 2 kids who are surrounded by, pop culture and media, and I mean, I talk to them about ecology, and I think they're into it and so forth, but whether there are people that are practicing that, and sustaining the ceremonies, I know a lot of people do. When we go to the Navajo, we see these kind of sweat lodges and thinking about purification ceremonies and so forth. But I'm sure that there are some families who have become assimilated and don't place value in it. Just that New York Times advertisement for Thinking Indian, I think, is a reflection on how difficult it can be to sustain that notion. That they have to sort of be reinforced.
Can I speak to that? I work with the Pennsylvania Lenape Indians, and while it's only a small segment of the Native community, they are very much activists as far as ecology is concerned, the environment, culture, history. They've just opened an exhibit in September at the University of Pennsylvania. It basically speaks to how they survived, because most of them were pushed out of the area. But it shows how they hid, and it tells the story of the Fourth Crow. The Lenape language is now being taught for the first time at Swarthmore College. So this community, while not large, is very much into holding on to tradition and culture and sharing it. They've had major conferences at the University of Pennsylvania, and they will continue. And they've brought in, a major group of other, Native Americans from across the country. So that's just speaking locally. They will be signing. They signed their first treaty since William Penn in 2002. They signed it again in 2006, and it's coming up for renewal again in 2010. And they invite environmental organizations who want to partner for a period of 4 years, either through programming. I mean, there's a number of ways. You could go on to lenapenation.org and find out more about them.
I think because Native Americans have always, because of colonialism, have struggled to maintain their environments and to protect them and resources, they are going to be, just to answer both your questions, sort of continue to be sensitive to these local and these international problems. We have to think about Native, in a traditional sense, Native relationship with land is a religion. It's not environmental. It's about a unified sort of day-to-day interaction with the natural world. So it's a spiritual or religious experience, which, when we talk about global climate change, I think, faith and science, we've been talking about this in Villanova quite a bit, how we can have conversations between faith and science. So Native Americans themselves are trying to bridge that gap.